Is reducing debt of the government equivalent to tightening of fiscal policy? Well, this is what we are going to discuss in today's video. Hi everyone, welcome back to Equipoise Classes. I am Surbhi Gupta, and in these videos we pick up economic topics from newspaper and current affair, and we try and understand the gist of the topic, that what exactly the topic is, and also at the same time we try and solve the purpose of the fact that how to read newspaper if you're preparing for any examination, how to read an article from examination perspective, and how to read an article in general if you are an economic enthusiast. So that's what we are going to do today. So I'll quickly share the screen and let's start reading the article because we'll do it directly from the newspaper. So yeah, let me just adjust my screen a bit. All right, I think we are good to go. Fine. So this is the title of today's topic, which is reducing debt is same as tightening fiscal deficit. So first of all, before starting this particular topic or video, I've already highlighted the portions, but I want to make sure if you have not read economics at all, if you are watching this video for the first time and if you don't know what is fiscal deficit, guys, fiscal deficit is basically, okay, so government earns something, we call it receipt, and government spends something, we call it expenditure. So government has two type of expenditure, okay, revenue expenditure plus capital expenditure. Okay, this is total expenditure. Then government has revenue. Okay, government has revenue receipt, right? Revenue receipt includes both tax receipt and non-tax receipt. At the same time, government has non-debt creating capital receipts. Government also has total capital receipts, but total capital receipts include everything else plus borrowing. Borrowing means government has money. Money is incoming. That means it's a receipt, but it's a capital receipt because it's loan. You have to pay it back. So it is debt creating. It is creating debt on you, right? Borrowing is debt. Borrowing is creating debt on you, right? So it is debt creating capital receipt. We are excluding it from calculation of fiscal deficit. Once we exclude it, we are the remainder is this formula. And then this is actually your fiscal deficit, which is eventually equal to borrowing. So in economics, we say fiscal deficit is equal to borrowing. Why? Because this is government's total expenditure and government owned receipts are not enough to pay this expenditure. So what will government have to do? Because government has taken all the receipts into consideration, be it revenue receipt, be it capital receipt. The only receipt that's left is debt creating receipt, which is borrowing. So government has no other way to finance this deficit but borrowing. So fiscal deficit is equal to borrowing. I think that really answers everything, which is what we are going to read in this article, because if debt is same as fiscal deficit, so if we are reducing borrowing, that means we are tightening fiscal deficit, and I think that's very clear from the formula itself. But still, we are going to read this article. All right, so I'll quickly zoom in as much as possible. Perfect, right? So conceptually, for the administration of any country, targeting, okay guys, I normally forget to read about the author. But author is very important because we are picking his article, so he should get the credit. So the author of this article is chief economist at Bank of Baroda and author of Corporate Quirks, The Darker Side of the Sun. Okay, so he's written this book and he is chief economist at Bank of Baroda. He's written this article. All right, due credits given. Okay, so conceptually for administration of any country, targeting its debt to gross GDP ratio, debt to, I mean, how much GDP the country has compared to that, how much debt it has, how much borrowing it has. This ratio is tantamount to control its fiscal deficit. It is not possible to influence the debt ratio without a firm grip on fiscal deficit. If you don't have fiscal deficit, it is difficult to control your debt. Why? Because if fiscal deficit is huge, then you will have to finance that deficit through borrowing, which means debt, right? So that's the issue. This issue has been on discussion table of late. The question is whether we should be obsessed with attaining a fiscal deficit of 3%, or should we realistically look at achieving a debt to GDP ratio of around 60%. These are the two debates. Okay, fiscal budget responsibility management act, FRBM act, it says that your fiscal deficit should be ideally somewhere between 3%. So yeah, the debt to GDP ratio should be 60%. So that's the debate altogether these days. That's what they're saying, that the debate is that should we maintain a fiscal deficit of 3% or should we maintain a debt to GDP ratio of 60%? Okay, a notable point is that fiscal deficit in itself is not significant from the perspective of economic sustainability, but it is the most important component of future debt, right? So fiscal deficit, on the look of it, may not seem very useful right now, but fiscal deficit kitna hoga, that will decide how much your future debt will be, like how much you'll borrow. So that is how it is actually, it becomes important in that sense, right? So, right, the fiscal deficit is financed mostly by borrowings. Okay, so the fiscal deficit is financed mostly by borrowings by central and state governments. These get added to the debt of the country. Okay, what are we saying? We are saying that the fiscal deficit is financed mostly by borrowings, as I told you. Okay, borrowings by central and state government. These get added to the debt of the country because government is taking debt for other reasons as well. Government is borrowing for other reasons as well, other than financing the fiscal deficit. But fiscal deficit is financed by borrowing, so it adds up to your borrowing, it adds up to your debt. Okay, in India, typically the debt ratio of the center is twice as of that of the states taken together. All the states taken together have X debt, so then the central government has 2X debt, double, okay, almost twice. In 23-24, for instance, the states had debt to GDP ratio of 28.2%, while centers was double that proportion at 57.1%, taking the country total of 85.3%. The country's total debt is 85.3%, out of which 57% is of the center, and states have half of it, like 28.2%. Right? So that's just we're trying to say that what is the scenario of the debt in our country. It has been observed that the center's debt ratio increased sharply from 50.7% in 2019-2020 to 60.7% in the COVID year. So COVID year, government had to borrow. Government had to make new hospitals, new sittings, medicines, what not, research and development. Government had to borrow, okay, in the COVID year. So it increased sharply. Government's debt increased sharply, mainly on account of fiscal deficit ratio doubling. Fiscal deficit ratio doubled, which is why government's expenditure doubled. And since government expenditure was huge component, and it had to be financed through debt, borrowing, so which is why borrowing also, it took a toll on borrowing, and borrowings increased sharply. Are you understanding what I'm trying to convey? I am trying to say that fiscal deficit, excess of expenditure of government, is financed through borrowing, because otherwise we have taken fiscal deficit के formula में we have included all the receipts. हमने सब reduce, हमने receipt government की, मेरी income है, I have receipts, I have revenue receipts, I have capital receipts, I've used all the receipts to finance excess of my expenditure, but still my expenditure is in excess. So I have no other means but to borrow to finance it, because otherwise I've used all my receipts, which were mine, disinvestment, everything, every component I've used taxes, I've used everything to finance excess expenditure. I'm still not able to do it. That means I will have to borrow. And when I'll borrow, that will add to the debt of the country. So government already is borrowing for many purposes. But if there is fiscal deficit, which is huge, fiscal deficit is increasing, that means it can be only financed through borrowing. So we will have to borrow. So borrowings will also increase, debt will also increase. That is what is written. In COVID year, government had to spend a lot. So the expenditure component increased sharply when the revenues did not increase by that amount, which led to increase in fiscal deficit, and increased fiscal deficit had to be financed through borrowing, which is why debt of the country also increased. Simple? Okay, I'm assuming. Otherwise, you can rewind. Okay, a similar rise was observed for states, although their combined debt ratio rose less steeply from 26.6% to 31.1%. The increase was not as steep. It was little flatter as compared to the increase in expenditure of the center, and you can understand very well why. Right? I don't think I need to answer the reason that why central government's expenditure increased sharply, when this did not happen for the states, which is why the debt to GDP ratio for center increased sharply, which did not happen in the case of states. It was not as steep. Okay, simple, fine. With their debt ratio rising from 2.6% to 4.1%. In years when fiscal deficit ratio came down, the debt to GDP ratio also moved south. South means down. Okay, so it's a very good way of saying came down, move south. North, move up, south, move down. Okay, so as fiscal deficit reduced, debt to GDP ratio also reduced. That is what they're trying to convey. Okay, it is certain that only when the fiscal deficit is reduced can debt to GDP ratio come down. When fiscal deficit is reduced, debt to GDP ratio come down. Fine. Okay. What is open to discussion is whether India's fiscal debt deficit ratio should be 3% or 4%. As for the debt, if we go by the latest norms set under the Fiscal Responsibility Budget Management Act, the debt to GDP level should be 40% for center and 20% for states, which means ideally it should be, okay, I'll change the color of the pen. It's like too much. Okay, it should be ideal scenario, center, states. We are saying ideal debt to GDP ratio. Centers can borrow 40%, states should ideally borrow 20%, making a total of 60%. What is happening right now? What is the scenario right now? See, the scenario is 57.1% and 28.2%. 57.1%, 28.2%. So currently it is 85.3%. Understanding अभी कहाँ पर हैं हम और ideally कहाँ होना चाहिए? Got it? Okay, perfect. Right, let's move down. Let's move south. Okay. Okay. All right. I think rather than moving south, I'm moving east. Fine. Okay, we're back. Is debt level 60% reasonable? Globally, countries, so we are arguing that in Fiscal Responsibility Budget Management Act, ideally we are saying it should be 50%. But now we'll compare our country with other countries and we'll see that where other countries are standing and what is their borrowing level. Right, in 2023, US debt was 122% of GDP. UK's was 101%. Japan was the highest, 252% borrowing of its GDP. For Eurozone, it was 89%. Within it, Germany was at 64%, while France and Italy had debt level of 110 and 137%. Okay, so that is the scenario of other countries. Fine. Switzerland had 38%, just 38%. It's not borrowing a lot. Among emerging markets, India ratio is comparable with China's and Brazil's, which had 84 and 85. So we are comparing ourselves. We are also standing at 85%, 85.3%. So we are nearly right now comparable with China and Brazil. South Africa's was 74%. This global picture makes a target of 60% appear too aggressive. Okay, may not be achievable. It sounds too aggressive, ambitious. Instead, a level of around 70 to 75% could be India's final goal. I mean, that much is fine. If you're saying 85.3% say 70-75 tak aa jao, that seems reasonable. But coming to 60% seems little aggressive. Okay, that's what they're trying to say. The broader issues that need attention relate to the attributes of government borrowing. For one, okay, now the broader issue is something else that needs attention. Okay, so what is it? Number one is the quality of spending. Okay, the quality of spending, like done with partly borrowed money, needs to be fine-tuned. So in a way, I would say that the quality of spending is the places where you're spending. If you're borrowing to spend on your day-to-day expenses, that's stupid. You should borrow. If you're borrowing, your quality of spending should go towards meeting capital expenditures, so that at least you are working towards long-term growth and development of the country. Because capital expenditure, that means either you're creating highways, you're creating roads, you're creating asset, right? Or you're reducing your liability. Both sense capital expenditure. Okay. So yeah, I mean, that is what is written here also. Need to set a target for what proportion is deployed as capital expenditure, which can support future income generation. Quality of spending should go towards capital expenditure. We should make sure what proportion, and a major proportion goes towards capital expenditure, right? Second thing we need to focus is tenure of borrowing. It should not be like borrowed for over 10 years and not paying. Tenure of borrowing should be short. We should know that we are borrowing for this much time and not beyond that. Okay, in 2023-24, over half of its debt was in this bracket. While it helps to spread out repayments, these debt securities reside on the books for that much longer and become sticky elements over time in government's outstanding debt. Okay, the third issue is cost of borrowing. We should take care about cost of borrowing. Short tenures cost less and would be beneficial, as interest costs account for around 25% of 2024-25. Union budget's aggregate outlay of 48.2 trillion. Okay, fine. So the debate is not really about targeting 60% or 70% debt to GDP ratio versus fiscal. So the debate, what we are debating is actually out of context. We should ideally not debate about this. We should debate about what we discussed: quality of expenditure, duration of expenditure, sorry, quality of the money that you're borrowing, where it is being spent, tenure of your borrowing, cost of borrowing. We should focus on these issues. Okay, the real concern is that we embark on a journey to lower government's debt and deficit levels. Its budget may run into a fiscal cliff. Okay, what does it mean? This refers to a massive obstacle that confronts a government that borrows less to keep its deficit and debt in check, but also has substantial expenditure commitments. Okay, in our case, this would include subsidies, farmer payouts, and various schemes, among other programs. The central fiscal deficit target for 24-25, that is this current year, is set at rupees 16.13 trillion, okay, which accounts for around 4.9%. So we should not say 3%, 4%. This is what we are targeting right now. Assuming it reaches 4.5% in next year and is reduced by half a percentage point in every subsequent year, with nominal GDP growth of 11%, which is right now somewhere around 7.2%, the deficit will come down numerically to less than the 2024-25 level by, तो वो कह रहे हैं लेस आ जाएगा ईयर 2027 का. Keep it slow, keep it like 5 percentage points every year you reduce, and you'll be well within your targets around year 2027-28. Okay, to sustain inflation, adjusted outlays on social welfare revenue growth must accelerate. This may prove hard, as optimal level may already have been reached. In such a situation, it could be a challenge to rein back expenditure to get the country's fiscal and debt ratios down. It is obstacle and challenging both at the same time. Okay, understanding improving India's fiscal deficit parameters are a matter of concern. But given global context, our ratios are not out of sync with the numbers in other countries, as we saw. Other countries are huge, like 101%. Japan being at 252%, it's huge. Okay. So yeah, by lowering public debt will relieve the government of its debt servicing burden and release funds for other developmental activities. The path taken should be cognizant of our particular economic conditions, with the center playing major role in welfare and infrastructure development. That means quality of expenditure that you are doing with the borrowed money. All considered, the path we are currently on appears appropriate. So the path we are on seems appropriate. That's what we wanted to discuss. That is why, when you see the ratio of our country, you will feel that, we are at really high, that ideally it should be 60%, 40% for the center. The debt to GDP ratio should be 40% for the center. Ideal, FRBM Act. According to FRBM Act, it should be 40% for the center and 20% for the state. But right now, so total should be 60%, but right now we are sitting at 85.3% of debt to GDP ratio. So it may seem very high, but when we compared ourselves with the global economies, with the developed economies, so we saw that the debt to GDP ratio, which means the borrowings are huge in that country. But again, we discussed that what matters is not the amount that you're borrowing as a percentage of GDP. What matters is that, number one, how are you spending that money? What is the quality of spending of the borrowed money? Next is the tenure of borrowing. Are you borrowing for years and years for next generations to repay, or are you willing to repay it by all yourself to generate future income through the quality expenditure on capital expenditure or on infrastructure development and all that? Okay, and third is cost of borrowing should be taken into account. So all these factors should be considered. So ideally, so initially we started this debate of either the fiscal deficit should be between 3 to 4% or the debt to GDP ratio should be around 60%. So what should we focus on? But actually, the debate, the real concern is not that. The real concern is something else, which we discussed throughout the entire video. If you liked it, if you found it useful, you know what to do. Like, share, and guys, 10 seconds, subscribe kar do. Please do subscribe, because I think still till date, 80%, 75 to 80% of you who are watching these videos are not subscribed to the channel. So what are you doing, guys? Just hit that subscribe button, get notified about the new videos. These days, I'm also uploading what I do generally, or what I like. I keep uploading shorts here and there, personal shorts. So I think it's a complete package of entertainment on this channel. If not, if you want more, so let me know, and I'll definitely try my best to serve you as whatever you want. So guys, with that, I would want to wrap up this video. Keep smiling, stay healthy, keep practicing, keep subscribing to my channel. And yeah, keep subscribing to everybody's channel, guys. It hardly takes any 10 seconds or so, but just subscribe karte ho, for them it really matters. And I'll see you tomorrow with another video. Till then, take care.